Hello everybody, tonight we are working on Chapter 2 in our textbook, and you can see the topic is controllers, and that's the C in the MVC, and we're basically going to build upon the application that we started last week, and hopefully you guys all got to that point where you were able to just do that initial build and get it to run and pull up in a browser. That's an important first step. Before we actually go into the nitty-gritty of what controllers are, I have to tell you a little bit about the application that we're building. It's an application that actually has been used to kind of demonstrate the capabilities of MVC for a while, and it's been out on the internet for a long time, and this isn't actually the only book that uses it as an example. And the truth is, you don't even need a book. You can actually go to the website and explore it. But the application that we're building, or the intent, just to kind of reiterate this from last week, is to build an application that's kind of comprehensive. So it'll have an interface. As you see, we already have a login and registration system kind of automatically, which is a beautiful thing. But we are going to build basically like a music catalog, so a list of like artists and albums and genres of music, where people can pull up the information and go in and click on an album and see what it's about, and then hopefully click a button to purchase it, etc. We also are going to build an interface ultimately that will allow us to manipulate the back end part of it, so we can add new stuff or remove it or add images or whatever it is that we want to do. So it's going to be a pretty comprehensive application that's going to carry us through most of this book, and we're going to be going step by step, and along the way learning how MVC works in this .NET environment, learning a whole bunch about C# a lot deeper than what we did the first time around. But the whole point here is kind of moving into this controller thing, and then reading some of the things that the author has to say here. And when we learned ASP.NET 1, the first class, the precursor to this one, we were working with a technology called web forms, and that is where we are creating windowed applications in some cases that, instead of like going to operating system native, they're pushing into a browser, but we're still kind of using the same approach that we were using to build operating system native stuff. Here we're kind of breaking away from that a little bit just because of the architecture, and a lot of the interaction mechanisms are still going to be form-based. So there are going to be like boxes to check and buttons to push and places to type in information or that type of thing, but it's going to operate in a little bit different capacity. Now let's talk about what a controller is in terms of this MVC architecture. So I'm going to just like highlight a couple little things here in the text. So it says controllers within the MVC pattern are responsible for responding to user input, often making changes to the model in response to user input. So that's kind of interesting right there. We haven't really talked about the model part of it very much in depth, but from the conceptual standpoint as to how like a web page comes up on your screen, you're presented with an interface, and because this is going to be an application with a back end and a database and all that, we're going to interact with the screen, and we're going to maybe click a couple of things and then hit a button, and then we expect something to happen. So the something that happens is first controlled by the controller. So when we send information back to the server, when we do our post back, the controller is going to receive it. It's going to look at the data that's coming towards it and then decide, based upon what we're sending it, what action it's going to take. So in a way, I always kind of look at the controller as kind of like the gatekeeper to the application server side. It might just actually say, oh, you just want to look at a different page. Well, here's the page, right? Or it might say, oh, you're looking up information about this particular entity. Let's go to the model, let's go to the database, we'll pull that information in. What do you want to do with it then? Oh, you want to see this detail? Well, let's find that detail and we'll pull that in. Okay, now put it back up on the screen. So ultimately, we're always going to be going through this process, maybe interacting with data, maybe not. maybe doing some back-end logic, maybe not. Maybe just putting up another screen, but ultimately it'll all come back to another screen that gets pushed back. So we always get a view that comes back one way or the other. But the controller is, once again, that gatekeeper. They have a little background here about controllers, and I think this is kind of fascinating without like really going in depth here. But you start looking at, when these thoughts started happening, real early on, really before we even had GUI stuff happening. And why do they mention Xerox here? Did we talk about that? Because they were the first ones to develop a graphical operating interface. That's pretty profound, even though they weren't the first ones to really make it happen. But when you work in a GUI interface, and the web is really kind of one of those interfaces, we switch our paradigm away from like static screens and stuff to event-driven programming, where we're reacting to mouse clicks or drags or data entry, and we're waiting for something to happen to trigger something else instead of like this top-down sequence that happens in a particular order. So that's kind of the point of this. Please feel free to read that to get a better example. Now, let's go back to talking about the Music Store application. And you know what? Because this is actually a thing that has been done already, and what you're going to discover if you go out on the web, people have done it with different versions of MVC. So in the past, when I taught the MVC stuff to our SharePoint group, and granted, it was different course title, but same concept, we used the exact approach that was done on that website. So even though we were using kind of new technology, we actually stepped back to MVC version 3 to make it all happen. All right. I'm really kind of curious as to how they're handling it in this book, and I hope they've updated it. But let's go to the website where this whole tutorial thing comes from. This is really kind of an interesting website to begin with. So if you guys really want to teach yourselves about how to build like a complete holistic project from start to finish, this Codeplex archive actually has a number of them. And notice this stuff is all open source. So you can go in there, you can find stuff that you can use as an inspiration to build other things, or at least kind of get the general approach. But if you wanted, you could come here without our book and build this stuff. Now notice the overview right there. MVC3, right. Okay. Now why that's important is we're working on what? 5, right? We're talking like 2 versions down the road. And let me tell you, there's some significant changes. Still, the principles of the pieces, regardless of what folders they set in, are the same. Okay, so please keep that in mind. And then notice how it talks about some of the other technologies that are being used and what tools to use. But if you walk through here, they actually have a tutorial that goes with the MVC3 version. You don't need this book to do this tutorial. And what's really ironic about this is probably the people who are watching this video right now, there's going to be a portion of them that are my students, right? And then I find that I get this large number of people just at random off the internet that come and watch these videos too. And I'm talking to you people right now, and that's absolutely fine because it pushes up my subscriber numbers. Like maybe someday I'll make money off of this, who knows? But this is here, and the reason I guess I'm pointing it out is if you want to talk about it, or if you want to look at some of the things that are going on, people have clearly talked about this here in the past on this website. So don't ignore this as a resource. The interesting thing is, going back to our book, is when you finally get this thing up and running, you have an application that basically looks like what I'm pulling up on the screen now. Okay, so you are going to have graphics that are provided to some degree. What the one thing that the author doesn't do is he'll put like album information in there, but he's not going to grab like the album covers, because we're stepping into copyright territory. But I have had students that have taken that extra mile. And I had one guy that went through and found all the albums that were listed and all the covers and put it in. You guys don't have to do that to get your A, just so you know. I'm fine little generics. But you can see you're going to have an interface that you're working with, and then you're going to have categories that come up. So you're going to have a store that's going to be created with a drop-down where you can narrow it down by genre. And then, so like in this example, they chose jazz, and then all the jazz albums come up. And then, of course, you can click on the jazz album, and it pulls in information. Now, we don't have to create all that information, just so you guys know. The author of this tutorial has pre-built, like, data files. A lot of them are either in, like, JSON format or C# format in some cases, and they're just text files, and we just read those and pull them into our application. We don't have to create that. Now, if you were coding something like this from scratch, guess what? You'd probably hire an intern. Or if it's your first programming job, that might be your job. Here, type all this album information into this text file. We'll see you in a week, right? That kind of thing happens. But just so you get an idea of what we're contending with. Another thing that you'll be able to do, obviously, is if you're looking at a record, is you'll get some sort of little breakdown like this. And maybe if it was a more robust set of data, it might actually give you a background on the album and have links to other things or who knows what. But ultimately, you'll have that add to cart button so that people can actually click it and put it in their shopping cart and hopefully purchase it. All right. Ultimately, we will have a shopping cart that will look kind of like this. And you can see that we've added some stuff. There's prices in there that are very reasonable. And then some control over the cart itself, including what you see at the top, which is the checkout button. Obviously, when you're going through like a payment process, you guys see these kind of screens, and this is very simplistic, but you get a person's information. And then, in addition, we're also going to have an administrative backend where we can look at all the different products that are available on the site, have the ability to basically add new content and do all the CRUD operations. And just like for those of you that were in my Ruby on Rails class, all one of you, there's some correlations here, and you can see like there's the edit and the details and the delete buttons, and there is scaffolding that happens inside of the MVC architecture, and that happens in .NET as well as it does in Ruby on Rails. So by virtue of the data models that we build, there's some very simple commands we generate that will pre-build some of these capabilities for us, which is kind of a beautiful and wonderful thing all at the same time. There's still tweaks you have to make to any application, even if there is scaffolding involved that kind of accelerates the process. The devil's in the details, and you want to make things work a certain way, so I think that's good to know. All right, so we're going to start with something pretty simple here, and that is something called the home controller, and then that's pretty common in most apps. So as you would anticipate, a home controller, if you write a snippet of code that is the home controller, you would anticipate that it would take you to the home page, right? And that's exactly what the author indicates here. He says, responsible for the home page at the root of the website, as well as an about page and a contact page. Remember, the controller is kind of like that gatekeeper or traffic controller, if you will, in terms of the application. I'm going to widen this out to full screen here. And what I'm going to do before we actually go in there is look at it on screen here. And we are going to see it within Visual Studio, so I'm not ignoring that fact. But I really kind of want to step away and kind of look at this code for a second. So you're going to notice that there's going to be a folder where we are going to store what we call our controller files. And if you look at those files, these are not ASPX files. These are C# files, right? Because what's going to happen is when you do some sort of an action in the interface in the browser and you want to go to the home page or the about page, for example, that controller is going to intercept that request and then based upon the code that you've written, tell it what to do. Now in this case, it's kind of a very simple thing, and you'll notice here, and I'll give it just a little bit of a zoom so you can read the code a little bit better, is we have this class file here. Okay, granted it's the home controller, and you guys remember what the colon stands for? Extend. So like if you're comparing it to the Java programming language, what we're saying is the home controller expands the capability of the class controller, which has certain features. So by virtue of controller, we're pulling in all the capabilities, methods, and all the stuff that goes with controller. So inside there, then we start to write methods, and we name them. One type of method is what we call an action result. So the result of some sort of on-screen action. In this case, it's going to be clicking on a menu item. And what are we clicking on? We're clicking on home, right? And what does home look for? It's looking for the index page, or the home page. So we create a method that is an action result index. What does it do? It returns a view. And remember I was telling you that just a little bit ago. Sometimes a controller, all it does is, oh, you want to look at that page? Fine, here it is. And that's all it is. Sometimes there's work that happens in the background first. So like if you scroll down, sometimes there's code that's added. Here it's very simplistic. It's just a text message that is going into a thing that we'll learn about shortly, which is called a view bag and a message. So that's just a type of object that holds a snippet of text so that when you go to the about page, this snippet of text is going to pop up. And then when you're done, it does a return of showing you another view. Same thing with the contact page. But if you can imagine a controller that gets a little bit more sophisticated, it's ours will as we kind of proceed, that capability to write any C# code that we want, any like logic that drives the program, whether it's mathematical or going through iterations of displaying content, whatever it happens to be, that code could get inserted here or call upon code somewhere else that would get inserted. Sometimes dynamically, sometimes statically. It really is very dependent upon the structure. But this is the kind of thing that we're going to see as we get moving. Now, as I zoom back out here, and you'll see that there are a couple of controllers that are automatically generated by what we're doing. So my point in pointing that out is that is based upon the fact that MVC follows a certain architecture and that we were using Bootstrap that built the whole thing out, right? So I'm going to go ahead and open up my project from last week. Remember, I got smart because I'm using Google File Stream here on campus, and Google Drive File Stream, which creates a drive letter that's really a cloud drive, does not allow me permissions to do a lot of the things I really need to do. So here I am using my OneDrive to store it because I don't feel comfortable personally working on any programming project where I'm not storing my source code in the cloud or just some online repository like Git. Just simply because what happens if somebody steals my laptop? Then I'm like, SOL. So cloud storage for me is always imperative, or some sort of code repository. If you guys are curious about exploring Git as a repository, please feel free. It is integrated into Visual Studio, so if you have a GitHub account, it's not that hard to push your project in there. Not the point of my lecture tonight, though. So let's go ahead and open up the project from last time and explore the folders just the way the author is showing it. All right, so if we go ahead and open up that controllers folder, we will notice that, well, we actually have one extra in there, don't we? But in the book, they had the home controller, and I'm just single-clicking this, folks, not double-clicking it, just single-click. And notice that this is the code that we're pulling in. Exactly the same thing we're seeing in the book. Did I create this? Nope. The template we chose created it automatically. Why? Because the template creators recognize that applications are built in patterns. Most websites that are application driven have a home page, usually have an about page, usually have a contact page. Pretty standard stuff. In addition, because it's this type of a application, there's usually also a account page, so a place where you can go to sign in. Now, this one, of course, is a little bit more complicated. Did I write this code? Heck no, right? Thank you, Microsoft, for generating it for me. But the code in here is not really all that difficult to understand. It is doing calls to certain types of objects and methods and libraries that we really haven't learned much about. And at this point, that's also not the focus. Remember, the focus here is we're learning about controllers. But notice that the actions that you would take inside of that like login or registration page are handled right here. So if you were, for example, I don't know, signing in or like logging in to manage some of the users that have the capability of signing in, the code for accessing those particular functions has been pre-built for you. And you can peruse it. And you know what, folks? It's pretty extensive because they built out a whole login and registration system for us so we don't have to do it. It's not cheating, folks. We're just using the tools available to us. You know, is it cheating for a roofer to use a nail gun? You could do it with a hammer. I'm sure the guy knows how to use a hammer, but he probably appreciates the speed of a tool that does the work a lot for him. Now, one thing that is different in this format is this, which is a different controller. But what you'll notice is that it mimics a lot of the same stuff that is inside the account controller, at least at the top of the page. My concern right now is not the contents of this particular file. So let's go ahead and jump back over to the book and move on. So now we are going to go into the application and start making some edits. All right, folks, now we're getting to our first tangible coding work here in this chapter. We are at the bottom of page 39, going into page 40 and step 1, and it says replace your application description page, that particular text, in the about method with a phrase of your choice. Perhaps, I like cake, okay? So if that's what you like, go for it, but they're showing you where to put it. Now, we already went through and kind of got a feel for where this is, but this is going within the about controller page, and the point is they want you to make an edit and then realize where that is happening once you bring it up in the application. So we're just going to go ahead and replace that message, and I'm going to type I like M and M's, and probably should be without spaces, right? You guys make the edit? Okay, very good. All right, so now we're going to go ahead, step 2, very exciting. We're going to see the results of our work. So you can do a Control-S to save if you want, but if you go ahead and hit the Run button, it really is going to save it for you. Just always remember that. So we're going to let it go ahead and do the build and launch the internal server. And then we're going to see the result, not on the home page, remember. The result is going to come up on the About page. So we have to let the application load first. The initial launch of the internal server is always slow. And I was having my machine was running pretty slow in the last class because I had so many darn windows open. But let's go ahead and click the About, and voila, the message. Now, interestingly, you guys should do a couple of different things. First of all, you should look at two different things when you're working with these kind of websites. Once you get to the browser, remember you have the approach where you can actually do the right click and view source. So you can actually see the HTML that's pushed back to the browser. Did we write any of this? Just I like M&Ms, right? And then the other thing you should do is right-click and inspect, and then in this view, of course, you have the rendered version of the code, which is different than the code that just gets pushed to the browser. So sometimes JavaScript is doing stuff in the background that the view source mode doesn't necessarily display on that first iteration of showing it. All right, but this, in essence, folks, is a success for the simple little thing we did. So we actually went in and we tweaked one of the controller methods and got it to work. So pat yourself on the back if you so wish, but come back to your Visual Studio here and go ahead and hit that stop button, and let's go back to the book and move on. Now, they do talk here a little bit about the different types of internal servers that are available inside of Visual Studio. And this is a pretty important consideration. Now, I'm assuming that anybody watching this video isn't brand new to ASP.NET, and certainly my students are not, because we've done a full semester course on .NET, and you realize that .NET requires basically a Windows web server to operate. So a Windows web server, formally, if you use a full-blown product, is called Internet Information Services, or IIS. And there are two different versions. There is an express version, and there is the full version. Any version of Windows, in my recollection, from 7 on up, and I think HP or XP in the Pro versions had IIS available that you can just activate and turn your machine into a web server using that technology. And that technology does allow you to deploy ASP.NET applications as websites. But what they're telling you here is that the URLs that are generated when you run the internal development server are somewhat dynamic. So for example, if you look at the launch, so if I go ahead and launch that server again, and notice this time how much faster it should go, right? And notice the URL it pulls up, and notice that it pulls up a local host and then a colon, and then it creates a unique port address just for this session. And every time you, I think, relaunch Visual Studio or a different instance of Visual Studio, it'll grab a different port dynamically. But the reason the author is pointing this out is when we start talking about some of the URLs that happen, because what you're going to discover here is that the URLs that we see in the address bar often help to control the application. So when you see store/browse, basically what he's trying to point out is that localhost is going to be relative here. So if you see the book saying localhost with a certain number, it doesn't mean that your number is going to be the same. So don't get tricked into that. But if you want to, make it go to an actual host name, you actually need a machine that has an actual host name, and most people's local machines are not that. Unless you happen to have a web server that's on Windows Server that actually has a real domain name, you're not going to get that. Okay. If you do want to deploy an application such as this, hosted out on the cloud somewhere, you can buy Windows-based hosting and push it out. There's a good chance that some of you might already have your own hosting, and it might even be Windows hosting, in which case you could push an application out. The other option that you have is you could load a version of Windows Server as a virtual machine and play with it that way, or you can, once again, make your own machine into a web host as well, although I really don't recommend that for most people. All right. So they show you here, basically what we already did is you bring up the site, click on the About page, and there's the message you just typed in. Woohoo! That was your first exercise for controllers. Now, our next step is actually to create our own controller, something completely brand new. Okay, so instead of building working with the pre-built pages, to do something fresh. So the goal here is the controller we're going to create is going to perform these functions. It says the index page lists the music genres that your store carries. So we got to get that to show up on the screen. Once we have that list up on the screen, we want to be able to click on the genre that we like, and it takes us to a page that shows all the different albums from our site in that genre. So like we saw in the example, you click on jazz, it'll bring up all the jazz records. And then once you have those albums up on the screen, then you should be able to click on each individual one and then bring up the detailed information on that particular page. Piece of cake, right? Well, there's a few steps that clearly are going to be involved. So I'm going to, at this point, I'm going to pull the book off to my second screen, like I normally do, and do the work over here. So I'm going to go back over to Visual Studio now and go ahead and click Stop on the web server. All right, so the first step is we're going to be creating our own controller. So what that means is we're creating our own class file. So we're actually going to go to the controllers folder and give it a right click. And then we're going to choose Add. And then following the example in the book, we're just going to go right over to Controller. Now notice Visual Studio is pretty intelligent. It understands our template, so it understands what we're putting in the controller folder. It's probably a controller. So it helps us along the way. So go ahead and click that. And then you are presented with a new dialog box that you have not seen before. I want you to take stock at this point of some of the options that are available to you. So notice that we are going to choose empty, but I want you to notice that there are a bunch of other options here, including some technology we're going to explore later on with Web API. That stuff's all here. And then notice here that even though we're choosing empty, right below it, there's controllers that we can pull in that have read-write capabilities. What would we be read-writing to? Database, sure. Or one that uses the entity framework, where we start to see Razor and a couple of other things in there. But for right now, we're going with empty, right? We're not looking to read-write a database or anything like that. We're just looking to put stuff up on the screen right now. So that's why we're going with empty. All right, so go ahead and click Add. And now we want to name it. Now I want you to notice that the convention here within an application is to keep the word controller in the name of a controller. And you don't have to do that, mind you, but conventions, over configuration. Remember that? So don't go like naming it something else and going, is this a controller or is this a model? Or keep controller in there, because that way you know exactly what it is. There's a reason these conventions exist. And what we're going to call this one is the store controller. And this is a pretty important one for our application. So go ahead and click Add. Now notice the dialog box, what it's saying right here. Scaffolding, right? What's a scaffold? Well, it's one of those things that like repairmen or workmen will put up. It's like, a framework that, notice the words I'm choosing real carefully, that you can climb, and it's kind of like pre-built, and you can get to things and you can do other things, right? So scaffolding is really exactly that. It's a framework that helps you pre-build certain things and gives you a lot of capabilities. Now the next thing that we need to do is we're going to create something called action methods. And we saw that in the pre-built controller. So if we go to the home controller, we were doing action results, right? And really what this is going to allow us to do is to make the application actually do something. So let's go to the top of page 44 now in the text and do a little bit of work. All right, so it says, step 1 says, change the signature of the index method to return a string rather than the action result. So we're going to do some tweaks here. So instead of action result, we're changing the keyword to string. I want you to remember, those of you that are my Java people, because that class comes right before this one, that in excuse me, C#, string is a class like it is in Java, but in Java they make sure that the capital S is here. That's not the case in C#, but it is a class also. And then instead of returning a view here, what we're going to do is, well, if we're returning a string, we better give it a string to return, right? So let's create one. And what they're doing is they want us to type hello from store.index, and then parens and close the double quotes. That's kind of interesting right there. So the question is this going to appear as text, or is this going to, is this going to like trigger something, or is it going to appear as text? What's your guess? I think it's going to come up as text. Why do I think that? It's inside double quotes. Right. So the initial inclination here is really what the author is doing is he's trying to show you like the practice of like, you know, what thing are you triggering in your controller, so you know that you're triggering the thing you think you're triggering instead of something else. That's the point. So you don't have to use that syntax. So you could say hello from store index without the parens and the dot, and get the point across. All right. Step number 2 says add a store browse action. So for those of you that do have electronic version of the book, or went to the CodeFlex tutorials and downloaded the source code, you can actually copy and paste some of this stuff. And that's what I'm going to do right now because typing is cumbersome. And then we're also going to add another action method here for store details, each of which is going to return a string. So for right now, we're just going to get it to return strings just so that we can see that it's working. Once again, just to clarify that. So I'm going to copy here from my PDF copy of the textbook, and then I'm going to paste in. And I think that's what's kind of nice here is you notice how the authors here are being very verbose with the commenting. And I think that's good, especially as we're learning and we're building, so that we're clear as to what we're doing. So, so one is going to be browse, and then we're just returning the string telling us which method is being triggered, and one's called details, and once again we're just returning a string that shows us which one we're doing. So at this point we're actually ready to run it again and kind of see what happens. So let's go ahead and Control S. Launch the internal server once again. And now let's take a real careful look at what happens next. Because this is going to go to the home page. Now, I didn't add any menu items, right? There's nothing added to our navigation. There's no links added to our page. But what we have created, and this is to demonstrate how controllers react to data that's passed in the URL, I am going to now append to my URL store, capital S, press enter. Okay, granted this is nothing fancy, but what's happening is it is reacting and what is it pulling up? Right? Because think about the URL here, folks. I'm not declaring a file at the end of it. I'm just saying store. So what does a web browser automatically look for when you go to the root of a folder? It looks for the index file. So the MVC framework looks for the index method. It finds it in the application, and then it executes the code. And all it's doing is returning a string. So if we go back to the browser now, and now append to that URL, we're keeping store in there because it's coming from the store controller. Now we're calling upon one of the other methods, which was browse, once again with a capital B, because that's how it was titled in the application. And then, of course, if we try the other one that we created, which was details, it pulls back that string. Now, very simplistic example, but really powerful in conception here, basically. So really what we're doing is we're showing that our application, when we press enter off that address bar, it's grabbing that URL, it's pushing it back to the server. The controller named store is intercepting it. Why? Because where else in the URL, right? So it finds store. If there's something that follows it, it looks for that method within that code. If there's something that doesn't follow it, it runs index, which we demonstrated. So hopefully that lends a little bit of clarity as to what's happening. Now let's take it another step. All right, so we've learned that just by the structure of our URL, we can call upon a controller and trigger code. By adding a slash and another bit, we're calling the controller followed by a method, right? So really what we're doing is we're triggering internal application code by virtue of a URL. Let's move on to the bottom of page 45 now, and we're going to add another thing to it. And what we're adding is the ability to not only call a controller and one of its methods, but also to be able to pass parameters to it and react to those parameters. So back to Visual Studio, hit the stop button. And now we're going to go to the browse method here. And what we're going to do to the browse method is we're going to actually add parameters within the parentheses. So I'm going to actually give that a zoom because it seems like that's a little small on the screen, so I apologize for that. And what we're going to pass into it is a string. So we need the data type of string, and the thing we're going to pass in is the genre. Right? And that was kind of one of the goals, if you remember that. And then we're going to change the code, or not change it, but actually add to the code inside here. And we're going to declare another string, and we're going to call it message. And the message is going to be as follows. So we're going to pull in this utility called HTTP utility. And I'm using the Visual Studio capabilities here to help me fill in the blanks. So HTTP utility.html encode, and then a set of parens. And inside here is where we're going to start putting some stuff together. So we're going to start with some double quotes and say a string, or excuse me, not string, store dot browse. Once again, folks, this is just text. But the reason we're doing this is so we know what we're working with, and when we hit it, so we know that it's working. And then comma, this is still text, mind you, genre equals in space. And then we're going to concatenate to the end of it whatever the genre is that we're actually passing in. So from a conceptual standpoint, what's going on here is we are going to add to our URL a little bit more than store/browse. We're going to add a little snippet of text to the end of it that will then be received by the browse method, inserted into that string, and then returned back to us. And instead of actually, and this is important, instead of returning this predetermined string, now we're returning the message that we typed, or assembled, is maybe a better way to say it. Now let's talk a little bit about these, why couldn't we just go straight to text? Okay, and let's explain that. And the book at the top of page 46 does talk about it a little bit. And basically, the author's response is, it sanitizes the user's input. What does that mean? Basically, that prevents clever hackers from inserting their own code into your application. So in the old days, we get these people that are clever, and it's like, well, here's an input field that it takes text. If it just goes in as straight text, I can drop in some JavaScript, or inject some SQL code or something, and mess up somebody's application. So that can actually do some pretty harmful things. So that it's really just the way the sanitizing is to make sure that people aren't injecting their own code. So let's go back to running the application. Make sure you save your work. Let it launch. And now we're going to add the URL again. And once again, we are going to go to store browse, but we're going to add to it in the form of a get statement a question mark, right? That implies that it's a get. And then we're going to type genre equals disco. And that goes right in the URL. Now the stuff that's following is the parameter passing. I'm going to press enter, and this shows me that it successfully received that and output it. And just to look at the code again as a comparison, we called upon the browse method, we passed it a string, and it's named, right? So that's why I'm calling it by name. Oh, curious, it's a lowercase g. Isn't that interesting? The point is, it's a parameter. The parameters go in the order that they're listed. It doesn't matter what the name is. We're just correlating. And then that is received in the message here, appended to the string we already have, and the message is returned to the screen. So we've learned that by virtue of our controller, we can call a controller, call an action method, and pass it parameters, act upon those parameters with code, and make something happen on the screen. And remember, folks, whatever you're doing on screen, whatever you're doing within your application, you're always pushing something back to the screen. So often your culmination is returning some sort of a view. So, let the wheels turn on that a little bit. Now we're going to go in step number 3 here, bottom of page 46, and we are going to change the details method. And if you follow what the book's doing, they're going to be passing an integer this time. Oh, yep, got to stop the server, sorry. Notice how the book doesn't tell you to stop the server? Because the first time you do it while the server's running, you figure it out. All right, so we're going to pass in an integer. We're going to call it ID, because that's what the book calls it. And then we're going to drop in very similar fashion, code like we did for browse. And I'm just copy pasting this time, folks. So once again, we're setting up a string called message, a little snippet of text, and we're going to feed back the ID. All right, so let's go ahead and do something a little bit more simplistic. And now, what I find fascinating about this is because we are passing a number over to it, the URL is a little different. Watch what happens here. So we will do store details. And instead of some convoluted get statement with a question mark and an equal sign and all that, we're just putting in a number 5. So that's our parameter pass for that, because it's numeric. Okay? go ahead and press enter, and you see that it successfully passed 5, and then it ended up in the string just as we would anticipate. And folks, believe it or not, that's our introduction to controllers. So if you want to experiment with this and try other things, you can add your own methods to play with. You could, do some math in there or whatever. Oh, wonderful. So one of my students here got clever. Apparently I've taught you sort of well. And you threw a string in, right? And you hit enter, and boom. Well, guess what we're going to have to do eventually? We have to write some code to prevent that from happening. Now, the chances that somebody would manually type in the ID number of one of the products in our catalog is probably slim to none. But there are things that we can do from a code standpoint that would prevent those types of problems. So, folks, this is the end of Chapter 2. I thought that was pretty successful, and hopefully you guys were successful as well. I'm going to end this video here, and we're going to pick up Chapter 3 in just a moment in a fresh video.